So almost a year ago, I made a video responding to Wisecrack's video on Legion, and it was actually one of my best performing videos. However, I felt like my arguments, my editing, and my delivery were really shit, honestly. I was responding to the video on the cuff without a script, I just lazily put gameplay in the background, and I didn't have as good a knowledge of Legion as I do now. It's funny to say that considering how many times I'd seen the show by then, but I've watched Legion a lot more since then, and my arguments regarding Season 3 have changed a lot due to that. So in order to make a more focused response, to make a video that actually reflects better the quality my content can be, and to debunk Wisecrack's claims through good argumentation and references, I decided to make this video, which is a scripted and thoroughly researched response to Wisecrack's video titled Legion is a Deep or Dumb Wisecrack Edition. So let us begin. And a reminder, spoilers for the entirety of Legion ahead. Their video starts at 2 minutes and 20 seconds into the runtime. Their ad read takes ages, but I do want to mention some things that they say just before they do the ad read. I find it funny how Wisecrackman says,
"So I just finished the final season of FX's mind-blowing series Legion, and walked away with, well, a lot of thoughts. And that's a good thing."
but never builds on that, so I have no clue why having a lot of thoughts about a show is a good thing, or why it may be in this instance. If you were me saying that, I'd definitely elaborate so I could explain it and potentially contrast it with what a bad show could do that'll leave you with a lot of thoughts but in a negative light. It's important to explain what you mean when making an argumentative video, so introducing a concept like this needs elaborating. However, this opening part is worthless anyway. It's giving a synopsis on the show, I guess to bait people into thinking the video is gonna start right away, that way they get more watch time, since a lot more people would close a video if it started with an ad read straight away. That being said, I also find it funny that they say,
It's got multiple reality-bending scenes, wild off-the-wall musical numbers and dance-offs, and with the addition of Season 3, time travel.
even though the show had time travel in season 2 too, so they're just wrong on writing on the synopsis of the show, so you can tell this video is gonna be great. So the premise for the video was introduced at the 45-second mark.
But with so much going on, it's a little hard to pry out one coherent show-defining philosophy, which always gets us asking, is the show smart, or does it just think it is?
Now, it's hard to grasp what they mean by that. Philosophy has some very vaguely defined meanings. It could be the use of reason in understanding such things as the nature of the real world and existence, the use and limits of knowledge, and the principles of moral judgment. Or maybe a group of theories and ideas related to the understanding of a particular subject, or a particular system of beliefs, values, and principles, or the way that someone thinks about life and deals with it. Now, how do we know which one Wisecrackman means? Well, the three definitions there seem to mean the message the show tries to pass. Maybe some unified moral judgment the show makes that's presented throughout, in which case it will probably be about the poor treatment of mentally ill people. In season 1, David's situation was poorly handled by his sister, who put in my clockworks but rarely visited, by his doctors who didn't know how to help, who wouldn't believe David when he said he was getting better.
If I tell them I'm sane, they think I'm crazy. And if I say, you know what, you're right, I am crazy, then they up my dosage.
Basically everyone throughout David's life, be it Philly, be it Dr. Pooh, or anyone he met until he met Sid, thought he was just crazy, that it was impossible he had powers. That caused them to focus on the schizophrenia. However, they never noticed he had a borderline personality disorder, something that only gets shown in the latter 2 seasons. So when he's taken by Melanie, she also has tunnel vision, but the opposite of what people have said throughout David's life. She thinks David isn't sick at all, that it's preposterous that he could be sick.
That's the old narrative, son. The schizophrenic delusions. You're not schizophrenic.
To her, the fact that David has powers blinds her to the possibility that David could have some mental illness. It's a blindness from the borderline personality disorder I mentioned. So in season 2, that gets highlighted to Sid by Farouk in chapter 18. Farouk shows Sid, even though he's manipulating some facts, that David isn't normal, that he's sick, while also being a very powerful mutant. Then in season 3, we get shown David rejecting his illness. He wants to be accepted by everyone. He thinks he's like anyone else, and that he deserves love, but he can't fathom that he's sick, because he's been told so many different stories throughout his life. So he lives in denial of his personality disorder. He didn't want to get treated by Division 3 for it. He couldn't bear going back to being
David the zombie.
I knew that in telling a story about mental illness, let's say, that starts with David where he was, which is he'd attempted suicide. He was in the hospital. That there's a kind of journey. Unfortunately, that's a cycle, right? You go from your lowest point to hospitalization, to taking your meds, to stabilizing, to thinking, I don't need these meds anymore, to going off your meds, to going down the rabbit hole and then back. You know what I mean? So that felt to me like if you substitute love story for meds, right, that, you know, David gets out of the hospital in that first hour. He's in love. That love buoys him. He ends up getting to from a place where he doesn't understand anything that's going on to a place where he understands everything that's going on. You know what I mean? And then, unfortunately, he's put in this position by the woman he loves that makes him betray the woman he loves, the same woman, in two different time periods. And that gets him to a point where he's off his meds and his decisions are less and less rational. And then he's down at the bottom, and he's either gonna come all the way back, or that's the end of him. And once you complete that story, the only place to go is back through that cycle. So that's why it was the 3 seasons.
And we have Sid, who has antisocial personality disorder, but she never really learns to deal with it. She's also suffered for that, like David. But unlike David, not only did she realize that a lot of what she's done in her life isn't good, and she dealt with the consequences and realized that it was her fault for a lot of the bad things she's done in her life. She also had a literal second childhood, where she learned what she needed to learn to become a better person and save the world in the finale. She got the care she needed, which David never had, especially since his parents abandoned him as a baby, and David needed them to be a better person. Now, that's one unifying philosophy. I could go on about them for a long time, since Legion is a very layered show. Or mention how Noah Hawley has said multiple times that Legion is 3 TV shows disguised as one. Therefore, looking for one unifying philosophy for the entire show is not necessarily the correct approach, but I think I've debunked that pretty well. They'll try to build up this point more, but at its foundation it already crumbles. Maybe they're using a different meaning of philosophy than I am, but then they need to explain the definition so we could understand the point. This is actually a tactic that a lot of video essayists use to try to seem like they've made a point, but actually they haven't said anything, so the viewer projects what they think the essayist meant onto the video. That way the viewer will more easily agree, since they're making the points for the video pretty much. It's usually some pretentious shit the essayist is spouting that is very vaguely defined, something we'll see a lot of in this video and that YouTubers like Just Right and High Top Films do a lot. Because of their lack of explanation, I'm going off official definitions, which means they're wrong. So before we get into their actual arguments, I do want to preface that the idea of a YouTube series where you try to analyze whether some piece of media is deep or dumb is quite interesting. The title is just for attention, but the intent behind it is good. We could basically be analyzing what could thematically be shown by that media and whether or not the piece of media itself contradicts it or reinforces that idea. One example of the former being The Last Jedi, a film that tries to use the theme of failure being the greatest teacher but constantly contradicting it, like with what Poe did in the beginning of the film being considered a failure by Leia and the meta-narrative of the film, despite the actual act of what he did being a big victory for the Resistance. And I guess an example of the latter being Mr. Robot, a show that deals with the theme of control, with the phrase control is an illusion showing up in lots of moments throughout the show. I don't want to spoil anything about Mr. Robot, so one example I can use to support that theme without spoiling it is how we have Elliot's monologue at the beginning of the show talking about people who like to play God without permission, people who nobody knows exist, but who control everyone's lives through the invisible hand.
There's a powerful group of people out there that are secretly running the world. I'm talking about the guys no one knows about, the guys that are invisible. The top 1% of the top 1%, the guys that play God without permission. Whoever's in control of the exit nodes is also in control of the traffic, which makes me the one in control. Sometimes I dream of saving the world, saving everyone from the invisible hand. One that brands us with an employee badge, the one that forces us to work for them, the one that controls us every day without us knowing it.
You sense something wrong with the world, something you can't explain. But you know it controls you and everyone you care about.
So I do think that this series could be a good idea as a concept. However, I don't like the execution that Wisecrack uses for this series because it focuses on how deep something is. It's basically trying to say whether something is pretentious or not by analyzing if they went as deep as they could with the concept or not. It's also really poor execution in the sense that they don't even give a final verdict most of the time. They don't state whether something is deep or dumb by the end of the video, which we'll see by the end of this video too. Now let's get into the actual video.
First, a quick primer on the show. And yeah, try to keep up. Season 1 introduces us to David Haller, who his whole life has been told that he's insane. But after being rescued from the government's grasp by a group of like-minded mutants, David learns that he actually has psychic powers and begins training to control his power. The only problem is that a powerful telepath, Amal Farouk, has been lodged in his brain since he was a baby and is now trying to take over his mind. While Season 1 ends with Farouk being kicked out of David's brain, Season 2 focuses on the group trying to kill him. Except not really, because we learn that David is actually kind of an evil asshole, not above torturing a friend to get what he wants or raping his girlfriend Sydney Barrett. In one of television's biggest bait and switches, Season 2 ends with the group befriending Farouk and hunting David. Fast forward a few months where Season 3 picks up. David has decided to live a quiet life as a cult leader for young women with abandonment issues.
My people.
Your commune. Talking about your commune where you seduce teenage girls with daddy issues.
That is, until the time traveler Switch arrives. But David's not interested in going back in time and righting his wrong. Instead, he wants to go so far back in time that he stops Amal Farouk from ever inhabiting his brain in the first place. In the process, stopping all the literal madness that has occurred since. The only problem is that Switch's powers aren't fully developed yet. And by going so far back in time, David has angered some seriously creepy baddies.
In the Hall of Time, there are demons.
Wait, demons?
Still, David and Switch keep at it, which causes some disastrous consequences for the present, like, potentially ending the world.
This is how he does it.
While Sydney and the others race backwards in time to stop David from doing any more damage, David meets up with his father in the past, telepath Charles Xavier of X-Men fame, and teams up with him to kill Farouk. Except future Farouk joins the mix and convinces Charles that violence isn't the answer. After one touching father-son moment and a slightly less touching but still moving past future Farouk moment, everyone comes to an understanding.
I'm saying that war is not the answer. It's the problem. David, we don't need this barbarism. I've made a deal with Farouk.
Are you saying we just leave?
I'm saying that we respect their right to exist and they respect ours. Yours.
With the past successfully changed, David and Sydney look over the crib at baby David before they both disappear into the ether, having effectively erased their own existences. And scene.
So they start off by recapping the show, and they do a pretty straightforward recap. They mention most of the important plot points, they explain how one leads to the other fairly well, and lay the groundwork for people who've never seen the show. It's not the best recap since you have some time from explaining some more confusing plot lines, they just shorten them to something that is slightly inaccurate, albeit easier to follow for a quick 2-minute recap of the show. So with them giving such an easy to understand recap of the show, it seems strange how, right after Wisecrack says,
"Now if all of that doesn't seem perfectly clear to you, don't panic."
Now, I know why they'd say this, because I've seen the video and the topic is Legion, but this is a very artificial way of transitioning from the plot recap to their arguments about the show. A transition that honestly isn't needed, but I do know why he said this. It's because Legion is known for its surrealist and absurd imagery, deep visual metaphors, or just with how it deals with the concept of madness in general, using it in its presentation. So that's a way that someone who enjoys the show but doesn't pay attention fully to what this guy is saying could feel like Wisecrack knows what he's talking about, since people who have seen Legion always describe the show talking about the madness part, the absurd imagery, which for most is the most memorable part of the show, so it's an easy way of getting the people who are watching the video on board with you from the get-go. Another reason is because they thought they needed to transition from the plot recap to their arguments to support their thesis, but they did it in a very lazy way since it doesn't actually make sense. It just seems like a blatant lack of redrafting, to be honest. So then Wisecrack says,
"From the get-go, Legion has always been about challenging the audience's expectations, and Season 3 is no different. Simply put, it's confusing. What does it all mean? Well, here's our 2 best takes."
Now, this is strange. He seems to be trying to find the Season 3 philosophy, but earlier he talked about a single show-defining philosophy that he couldn't find. This is just, on a fundamental level, breaking their video even more, because each season has a very clear unifying philosophy, message, or theme, whatever you'd like to call it. Season 3 clearly has the idea of nature versus nurture. While keeping the idea of the madness that haunts David, we raise the question of what caused David to be the way he is. Was it him getting powers from his father and getting the mental illness from his mother? Or was it that he was raised in a house that wasn't his own, with a parasite in his head that believed himself to be David's paternal figure? That idea is present throughout Season 3. The show doesn't make definitive moral judgments, which I like because doing so is not usually the sign for good writing, but it does raise those questions to try to understand the nature of human beings, something that's actually been present since the first season of the show.
We are here tonight to talk about violence, or maybe human nature. We are here to talk about human nature.
Now, there are more ideas Legion Season 3 explores, of course, so let's see what Wisecrack finds with Season 3 and what it could all mean. So their first idea for what Season 3's event could mean is called
Idea 1: Metaphor and Metaphysics. In case it wasn't immediately obvious, Legion thrives on an ambiguous sense of reality. Throughout the show's 3 seasons, we are constantly asking ourselves what is real or true. Is David Haller really David, or is he the host of other personalities inside his head?
Who the hell are you?
I am Legion. I am
Legion.
What Wisecrackman was saying made perfect sense until he actually started to bring in references, since the question he asks about David being actually David or the host of other personalities inside his head is retarded. David is David. There is nothing to indicate he's not, but he also hosts other personalities in his head. It's part of his powers, something explained in chapter 7.
I'm you. Your rational mind. You're having a breakdown, a stress response. Your power is kicking in to save you. It created me.
No, I haven't read all of the comics yet, but the only reason I can see why Crackman got to that question is through the comics, since there's nothing on the show to indicate David is not actually David.
Is Amal Farouk really evil, or is he actually a loving surrogate father?
I love the boy, Charles.
This question has nothing to do with the ambiguity of reality that Wisecrackman was talking about. This is a question of moral ambiguity, whether Farouk wanted to torment David or if he actually loved David like a son. At any rate, Farouk is quite villainous. He's not a good person. You could say he's evil easily. He's quite sadistic and apathetic in regards to the pain and death he causes. But that doesn't mean he isn't a surrogate father who loved David. Not only does he have multiple lines of dialogue that prove that.
Trust me, Juno. You can't make someone love you. I've tried.
With who? Your toadies?
No. With you.
I've lived in your son's mind for 32 years. I saw what he saw. I felt what he felt. I thought what he thought. And over time, what was once a prison became a person.
But it seems like Wisecrack have a very black and white view of abusive parental relationships. Just because a parent is abusive to their child, that doesn't mean they don't love them. A good example being Thanos in Infinity War. It's clear he loves Gamora, even Nebula, though not to the same extent. But he's very abusive, and that's what makes Gamora's death so meaningful to Thanos. The fact he has to sacrifice someone he loves, that also loves him back. Maybe out of some form of Stockholm syndrome, maybe because it's the only paternal figure she had most of her life. Despite the clear physical and mental abuse Thanos caused Gamora, they still had an emotional attachment to each other. That example comes from other media, of course, but it also happens commonly in real life, because human emotions are a complicated thing, and it seems like Wisecrack are viewing them very binarily. Farouk can both be evil and love David like his own son and care about him. They're not mutually exclusive.
As it turns out, much of this ambiguity stems from the show's unabashed love for metaphors. But when we say metaphor, we're not just talking about simply comparing two things, but a very specific philosophical sense of the word. Borrowing from the work of philosopher Richard Moran, we can say that metaphors create a sense of ambiguity because of the framing effects they produce. In Moran's view, metaphors force people to consider an object or situation in a new light by contrasting it with another. Importantly, this framing isn't fixed, nor is its meaning, and this is where our ambiguity creeps in. When the show calls Farouk a monster, for example, this can mean anything, from the fact that he's technically an alien life form, to the fact that he's incredibly powerful, to the fact that he once trapped a king's mind inside that of a monkey's.
After doing research on Richard Moran's work on metaphors, I'd say Wisecrack did a really poor job at explaining what Richard Moran means by metaphor. According to Moran, if we think of the words as a metaphorical expression as undergoing a meaning shift of some kind, it will have to involve a difference of meaning very different from that involved in ordinary ambiguity. For when an expression is interpreted metaphorically, the first interpretation, the literal one, is not cancelled or removed from consideration. The literal meaning of vulture is not dispensable when we interpret it metaphorically in its application to some friend or relation. The literal meaning must be known to both the speaker and the audience for the metaphorical point of the epithet to be made. It has everything to do with clarifying the speaker's intentions that she chose this word, with its literal meaning applying to a kind of bird, to refer to this other thing which is not a bird. And when we start to figure out the reason why the speaker is using this word with its literal meaning in this context, we have begun to interpret what she is intending to get across metaphorically. Simply characterizing metaphor in terms of a change of meaning fails to capture the role of the original literal meaning, but the dependence of the metaphorical on the literal runs deeper than this, and raises further doubts about the appropriateness of the idea of meaning shift in metaphor. Further description of interpretation given so far might apply just as well to a situation in which a person is speaking in a kind of code, in which someone has to interpret her utterance in such a way that certain words are to be replaced by specific other ones. He might conjecture that vulture is one of these words and hit upon the right substitution for it. In such a case, we might well speak of the word vulture being given a different meaning or application in this context. The case of metaphor differs from this in several ways. First, and perhaps most obviously, there's nothing corresponding to a code for a live metaphor, and no rules to appeal to for going from the literal to the metaphorical meaning. Further, in the case of genuine codes, the original meaning of the words will normally be incidental, at best, to the new meaning. And in fact, a coined expression with no previous meaning in the language may do just as well, if not better. In metaphor, on the other hand, If we are to speak of a new meaning, this meaning will be something reachable only through comprehension of the previously established literal meanings of the particular words that make it up. And this dependence of the metaphorical on the literal is rather special, in ways that exacerbate difficulties with the view of metaphor as involving a change of meaning. For the first, literal reading of the expression does not just provide clues to help you to get to the second one, like a letter that is later kicked away, but instead it remains somehow active in the new metaphorical interpretation. It is not similar to a case in which we first got the meaning wrong and have now successfully disambiguated it. Rather, the literal meaning of vulture remains an essential part of the meaning of metaphorical expression, otherwise one will have no sense of what metaphorical comparison is intended. If something like meaning shift is involved in this, then we must explain how the literal meaning of vulture could play any role at all in the generation and comprehension of the metaphorical meaning, if it is this very same original meaning that is supposed to have changed, or to speak a bit less confusingly, if the word has now taken on a different meaning. Now, of course I'm not extremely well versed in this, but what I gather from all this babble is that metaphors, according to Richard Moran, can be used when they take the literal meaning of a word and apply it to a different circumstance or scenario to get a comparison between two things. Example he used being calling someone a vulture, whereas the person is an actual vulture. It's comparable due to the characteristics gathered by the literal meaning of the word vulture. So, the example Wisecrack used was calling Farouk a monster, where we can take definitions of the word monster, such as any imaginary frightening creature, especially one that is large and strange, or a cruel person, and apply them to Farouk and see what fits. Of course, Farouk is a very cruel person, so the definition applies there, but they also say that it could be because he's an alien life form, which is wrong since he's a mutant. They never call him an alien in the show, even though you could argue that the Shadow King is an alien in the comics, but we're going by the show here. And that fits the definition of monster that people use of something unknown and frightening, though their second example, being that Farouk is extremely powerful, works better with that, I'd say. Though I prefer to think the metaphor works best with that definition I showed, since Farouk was a parasite inside David's mind which caused David to see and imagine things that weren't there, like the devil with yellow eyes, who's an imaginary frightening creature who is large and strange. Though I also like how David has a line in the show where he mentions what monster means to him, which I think makes David's meaning behind him calling Farouk a monster quite clear.
My doctor used to say that the word monster is not a noun, that to be a monster, you first gotta do something monstrous.
But I digress. And the other example being Farouk trapping a king's mind inside the monkey, which fits that second definition I showed perfectly of someone who's cruel. So the example they use to convey what Moran means is good, but the way they showed it is not, since they're overcomplicating things. What Moran describes is a normal metaphor, something being compared to another to create some sort of connection between the two things, and how something that has more than one meaning could have its different meanings applied to the metaphor at hand. I'd say Wisecrack used the study by Moran to sound smart when they could have just explained what they meant way easier. So I took this big detour to make clear what was meant by the use of metaphor by Richard Moran that Wisecrack are trying to use in their video, which is pretty much the universally understood way of using metaphors. So now we can get back to what they're saying.
By monster, you mean like a metaphor, right?
As philosopher Donald Davidson points out, most metaphors don't possess definite meanings any more than dreams do. After all, when Romeo compares Juliet to the sun, there are 1,000,001 different things it could mean. In the same way that dreaming you're naked in front of your high school class could mean both everything and nothing. But what's important here is that by framing Juliet with the sun, we're creating an infinite amount of associations. According to Davidson, just like in dreams, a metaphor's meaning is interpretive.
This is a better explanation of another philosopher's take on metaphors, which actually complements what their first example was. Well, so far at least. In the end of the video we'll see that it actually doesn't, but we'll get to that. Metaphors are comparisons between two things, like calling Farouk a monster. When you do so, you create a big number of associations as to why Farouk would be a monster, going by the definitions of the word used, in this case, monster. Now, I disagree that there are infinite interpretations when you make a metaphor, because context will always lead you down a path of just a few interpretations. Not only that, but words have finite meanings, and even if you use the example they used of comparing Juliet to the sun, there are finite characteristics about the sun, so it wouldn't be infinite interpretations. However, the sentiment that there are multiple interpretations that can be gathered from metaphors actually makes sense and was well explained here. And the comparison with metaphors in dreams is good to showcase what they mean by the multiple meanings. Now let's move on to how that applies to Legion.
At its best, the dreamlike logic behind metaphors really does drive home how ambiguous Legion's reality really is. Take Season 2, in which episodes often begin with an educational segment that later contextualizes the action on screen.
Psychologists call it a conversion disorder, in that the body converts a mental stress to a set of physical symptoms, in this case a tic or spasm. And, like any disorder, it can be contagious.
At first, these segments seem to contextualize our understanding of the various telepathic phenomenon going on in the show. The spread of our teeth-clacking zombies, for example, is compared to the way conversion disorders like laughing fits and mass hysterics have spread throughout history. In another segment, delusions are characterized like parasites, feeding on rational ideas until only they are left. This, in turn, later explains the spread of the delusion among the members of Division 3 that an admiral must be killed.
All I have are rumors, whispers. People go to Admiral Fukuyama's pedestal and they don't come back.
What does he do to them?
He eats them.
It's not gonna happen to us.
In both cases, these metaphors seem to contain fairly simple meanings. Madness is contagious, and delusion is destructive. But of course, meaning is a moving target with metaphors, and reality is constantly shifting under your feet in Legion. While we spend a whole season thinking we understand what these metaphors mean, the last episode of Season 2 really rips the rug from underneath our collective feet. The madness that had been spreading, the delusion that had been growing, it was David, and boy were we wrong.
David Haller, your treachery has been discovered. The inevitability of your future crimes.
Now, this was mostly well and good. Regarding the educational segments, which they say Season 2 episodes often begin with, despite only 2 episodes of the 11-episode-long Season 2 starting with those segments, Wisecrack says those educational segments later contextualize the actions on screen. It seems like he failed to realize how each of the segments applies to way more than just what he said. Each of the segments is relevant to the episode they're shown in, but they are also brought back after Sid, Carrie, Clark, and Patonomy go after Admiral Fukuyama, and Patonomy ends up dead.
So what have we learned? That a delusion is an idea. That an idea can be contagious. That human beings are pattern-seeking animals. By which I mean we prefer ideas that fit a pattern. In other words, we don't believe what we see. We see what we believe.
Of course, all those segments also apply in the finale of Season 2, but it seems like Wisecrack failed to realize the other instances where they are relevant, while also ignoring multiple segments like that and only pointing out 2 of them when they say,
in both cases, these metaphors seem to contain fairly simple meanings. Madness is contagious, and delusion is destructive.
Whereas each segment builds upon the other, which Wisecrack did not account for, but that the show specifically points out in the scene I mentioned after Patonomy dies. Also, when they say,
in another segment, delusions are characterized like parasites, feeding on rational ideas until only they are left. This, in turn, later explains the spread of the delusion among the members of Division 3 that an admiral must be killed.
This is just false, since the spread of delusions about Admiral Fukuyama is something that we see explicitly and physically happening. Now, the show uses eggs to form a connection with the John Hamm narrations because it's a mental parasite, which can be compared to mental disorders, but it's all an illusion fabricated by Farouk to make Division 3 lose precious time while he looks for his body. My point is that the spread of the delusion isn't explained by the John Hamm narration, but rather it works and is explained within the world. And John Hamm's narration compares that and brings that to real-world scenarios. This is actually a great example to use for the multiple meanings metaphors can have, when John Hamm says,
a delusion starts, like any other idea, as an egg.
He's using a metaphor to explain how delusions work.
Identical on the outside, perfectly formed. From the shell, you'd never know anything was wrong. It's what's inside that matters.
But then Farouk uses a literal egg to birth a parasite, insanity, to infect Patonomy. It's a delusion genuinely starting as an egg, but then in the finale the delusion from David doesn't come from an actual egg. It's just a metaphor that John Hamm meant in Chapter 9. So John Hamm compares scenarios from the real world and fictional scenarios to explain concepts so that the audience can understand them in his narrations, which is him using metaphors to make those educational segments clearer. This would have fit their point a lot more, but instead they went with the idea that those segments, when applied to the full context of the season, now have different meanings. Which, while true, isn't fully what they should have said to support their argument about metaphors. It's also contradictory what they say about metaphors. Before, they used Donald Davidson's definition, and I explained how, from Davidson's point of view, metaphors can have multiple meanings depending on context. And what Wisecrack said is,
while we spend a whole season thinking we understand what these metaphors mean, the last episode of Season 2 really rips the rug from underneath our collective feet. The madness that had been spreading, the delusion that had been growing, It was David, and boy were we wrong.
This implies that there is only one meaning behind the metaphors for what John Hamm said, that we thought we knew the meaning but it was something else, despite it clearly being applied to different scenarios, causing different meanings, like I showcased already. I also want to say how the clip they used after they said that has nothing to do with what they said, it's just a clip from the scene he's referencing, but it doesn't support his argument whatsoever.
However, while the end of Season 2 might have been a high point for Legion's thematic use of metaphors, Season 3 demonstrates how sometimes the show can collapse under a metaphor's weight. Because let's be real here, some metaphors, like dreams, make zero sense at all. I think the best example of this would be Season 3's depiction of the astral plane. As if it was purposefully designed to give us a headache, the astral plane is both a literal and metaphorical place. Amal Farouk at one point gives us this no-nonsense definition of it. Well, at least by Legion standards.
This is the astral plane, a world beyond the world, made of pure energy. Very few can see it.
Meanwhile, Oliver, tells us that the astral plane is kind of like the island of misfit toys, where broken minds, forgotten truths, and lost objects all collect.
We were always finding things. Pens, poetry, socks. The astral plane was like a magnet for lost dreams. Minds. That was the other thing we found. In the real world, when people lost their minds, they ended up here.
Now we come to the biggest problem with Wisecrack's arguments, at least in the first half of their video. Their entire first point hinges on the fact that the show has Farouk giving that explanation, and the explanations given in previous seasons, but that Oliver gives a different explanation in chapter 25, despite the fact that Oliver's explanation is not about what the astral plane is, it's an explanation of what the world he created within the astral plane should teach Sid the lesson she needed to learn is, and that's made clear in the end of the episode when Oliver undoes the fantasy, and him and Melanie go back to wearing their normal clothes, and when we have this dialogue.
We did our part.
You can do this. Just remember everything we taught you.
Where they actually say they did their part in giving Sid a lesson. So, when Oliver said the astral plane is like a magnet for lost dreams, he means the astral plane he created, which may not be clear if you watch the episode only once, but I've seen it 6 times at this point and it's clearly what they imply during it. It's also proven further by Farouk saying,
a world beyond the world, made of pure energy. Very few can see it.
And by how Oliver mentions the astral plane in chapter 4 as an actual place.
You're here, in the astral plane.
That first clip is also a clip they used in the video, and I'd like to address one line that could potentially bolster his point, but it actually really doesn't. So Farouk says that the astral plane is a place made up of pure energy. Now, using the definition of what energy is according to physics, that would prove that the astral plane is indeed a physical space and thus prove their point. However, of course, that's not true to what happens in Legion. Of course, since it's dealing with something called the astral plane, this is something relating to the mind more so than the body, with concepts more so than actual physical objects. Therefore, it's following what we know as metaphysics, which means the following. Metaphysical is a term that defines the organic life force that is not physical. There is a life force like the force that creates the growth of a new seed or the bloom of a spring bud. This life force is termed metaphysical. The physical aspect of life is what the human eye knows as real, but humans are quite limited in their ability to stop and recognize the entire spectrum of life. The physical aspects of life, like the human body, and the material world of the entire universe are amazing, but only a small piece of the entire universe qualifies. Most of what is real is metaphysical. Most of what is real cannot be seen or touched in the usual manner, which then means that the energy that Farouk mentions is not physical, so it cannot prove Wisecrack's point. Even then, energy as a term means the ability to do work, which then means that any and all possible work done in the astral plane would require energy, even if it is some sort of mental or metaphysical energy, so it's not a huge stretch from the actual physical definition of energy. So Wisecrack are just wrong there, which is a huge issue and it's the crux of their argument at this point.
On the surface, we're presented with an interesting problem. How can a metaphorical place where literal lost dreams come true also be a real place?
And there we are. The problem they raise comes from a misunderstanding of the show and the episode at hand. I don't even have to respond to this since I've already proven their argument is flawed.
And what does this tell us about the larger logic motivating Legion? Well, one way we could go about this is to assume that both the physical and mental properties are equally real in the show. If thoughts and matter all contain some, for lack of a better word, mental stuff, then it goes a long way in explaining how a metaphorical world like the astral plane can double as a real physical place.
Now, the astral plane is not actually a physical space, as explained by Oliver in chapter 4.
You're here, in the astral plane. You went too far into the make-believe and got lost. Your mind, consciousness.
And now you're trapped in this no place, where every day is the same, where you can imaginify yourself a kingdom, but nothing is ever real.
It's a place that psychic mutants can access and create things with their minds.
We can make anything we fancy in this arena of infinite promise.
But it's not physical. Minds can be sent to the astral plane by other mutants, like the main characters are in Chapter 5 by Farouk and David, or Melanie is with Oliver, or in other moments Sid is with David. It's all related to how minds work.
It's the muscle, my dear. The big gray meat. You gotta work it out. Get it stronger. Learn this stuff. Tasmin Bekir. You decide what is real and what is not. Your will. حقیقت رو تو به وجود میاری.
Be it a psychic mutant sending impulses to a normal human's brain.
It's all an illusion. I see that now.
Where are we?
Just a room by a beach. I made it. They're signals, that's all. What you see, what you hear. Impulses sent from nerve endings. Electricity in the brain. Real, fake, it's all the same.
Or how a mutant interacts with the astral plane itself.
You went too far into the make-believe and got lost. Your mind. Consciousness.
It's also made explicitly clear by Farouk in Chapter 20 that it's not a physical space.
I'm not supposed to be here. Wherever this is.
This is the astral plane. A world beyond the world, made of pure energy.
Also by David.
It's a mental space. You imagined it, I made it real.
And by Farouk in Chapter 26.
It exists between time and space. A land of the mind.
These examples all show that the astral plane relates to the mind and not the body, which is made even worse for Wisecrack's case when the definitions of physical are relating to the body, or relating to the body as opposed to the mind, or relating to things perceived through the senses as opposed to the mind, tangible or concrete. That's all to explain how the astral plane isn't physical, but they also call it metaphorical. Now, the definition of metaphorical is not having real existence but representing some truth about a situation or other subject, which isn't true either. The astral plane, despite being a mental space, does exist, only not physically. Other definitions of metaphorical are when you use something to stand for or symbolize something else, but the astral plane is never used to symbolize or to stand for something else. Unless you think the creations that mutants make in the astral plane stand for things in the real world, which is true, like when David creates a room by a beach in Chapter 4 that's meant to simulate an actual physical room as opposed to being in a room itself, since it doesn't physically exist. It's hard to grasp if the astral plane is metaphorical or not because it's a weird concept, since it has to do with being a mental space, yet being at the crux of time and space, which means it actually exists, yet the creations in it are not physically existence, like the plane itself, which isn't physical. Considering that, I guess I can concede it is a metaphorical place with how the creations in it are meant to represent things that have real existence, while the representations of them in the astral plane don't have real existence due to the mental projections in a non-physical space. However, I do feel like the word spiritual fits way better with what the astral plane actually is, since it means relating to people's thoughts and beliefs rather than to their bodies and physical surroundings. But that would fundamentally change the argument they're making, which would have been good, but wouldn't have helped their case. With all that said, Wisecrack's point is still heavily flawed since I proved the astral plane isn't a physical place by any definition of the word.
So, for example, while we might usually think of being heartbroken as an emotional state, in the astral plane, you could literally find the embodiment of your broken heart bleeding out in the street.
Don't forget your heart.
This isn't true at all. In the astral plane, psychic mutants are able to create projections of things like a beating heart and leave them in a street, but it's not something you just find, because to find something in the astral plane, first it needs to be created by someone with the ability to do so. Someone needs to come up with the concept and create a projection of that. It could make sense if they developed this point, but of course they don't, so we don't really know what they mean by it, which means I'll take it at face value to be as fair as I can be.
By having these mental states manifest themselves physically in the astral plane, the show seems to be advocating for a sort of panpsychic doctrine. Distilled into its most basic component, panpsychism holds that the old Cartesian divide between mind and body isn't really a divide at all. Instead, the panpsychist believes that everything, from the glass in your smartphone to the neurons in your brain, contains fundamental mental elements.
Now we know why they were so adamant on the idea of the astral plane being both a physical place and a mental space. It's because they wanted to use this concept of panpsychism in their video, despite it clearly not fitting. Now, their explanation of panpsychism is good enough to understand what it is on a basic level, though I'd argue they should have spent a much longer time talking about it because it's a very broad concept that's hard to understand due to being very abstract, but it's not the worst explanation they've had, so let's continue.
Now, before you start worrying that the ground beneath your feet has feelings,
I just want to nitpick this for a moment. That joke doesn't work because they kept the entire clip in the video instead of cutting before we see the flower switch stepped on. It'd work a lot better if they just left in the sound and cut before we see the flower, so it'd seem like it fits at least.
Now, before you start worrying that the ground beneath your feet has feelings,
the way it stands, it's just a clip from Legion that makes their already unfunny joke less funny.
panpsychists usually don't commit to the idea that everything has thoughts. Instead, most believe that everything has a mental experience. The mental experience of a human might be quite complex, while that of a fly might be much simpler, and that of a rock would be even more basic.
Now, there's not really anything in Legion that could in any way symbolize that it abides by or talks about that philosophy other than one scene in season 1.
Objects have memory too.
However, they're looking for an overarching philosophy on the show, something that's a clear message or theme in the show. So one scene in season 1 that supports the idea of panpsychism isn't really an overarching philosophy. Even more so when they started this first part of the ideas that Legion explores talking about season 3, and Legion doesn't ever address anything remotely close to panpsychism in season 3.
To most panpsychists, mental experience is a fundamental building block of the universe, with actual thought only being achieved by sufficiently complex entities. Applying this model to Legion, we can see how both regular everyday objects and abstract ideas like the loss of innocence appear in the astral plane. They all have a mental experience.
This makes it clear that Wisecrack only watched Legion once. When we see that redhead called Cynthia, we're able to notice that she's the same redhead who was in David's cult. It's the same actor playing her. She was killed by Carrie a few minutes before, and what it seems to have happened is that Oliver captured her mind before her brain died. She used it to teach Sid the necessary lesson I mentioned earlier in the video. It's not her manifesting as the loss of innocence, it's Oliver using her as a representation of it to show it to Sid. The astral plane doesn't have a mind of its own like Wisecrack seems to think, so it can't create these concepts without someone there to create them themselves. At this point they've just made hinges on them being correct about the premise of what the astral plane is, which I've already proven they're wrong about.
It also goes a long way in explaining why David struggles to differentiate between his mind and reality. They're all made of the same mental building blocks.
This is beyond retarded. David has lived his entire life with a parasite in his head, manipulating what he sees, thinks, and remembers. He learned he has superpowers fairly recently, powers that create other personalities in his head if they're needed, and he has borderline personality disorder. To say that David can't differentiate real life from his mind because they're made of the same building blocks makes no sense and is based on nothing. When Carrie says,
"Your mind can't reconcile the person we see with the person you think you are,"
it's not referring to some sort of panpsychism, because that wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. It's actually building on the idea of what Sid said.
To think that you were sick for all those years and then to be told that it was a lie, that you have these powers. This monster in your head, everything Melanie said, that you weren't mentally ill, when the truth is, you're both.
The fact that Wisecrack thinks panpsychism has anything to do with it is pure conjecture. They want it to be the case so their video seems smart, when in fact it isn't, which is pretty ironic considering the video's asking whether Legion is deep or dumb.
His mind is fixed. His reality is alternate.
Not only does that clip have nothing to do with what they're saying, it only relates to David's mind. It says nothing about his body at all. It's actually contradictory to their point. When Farouk says David's mind is fixed, he means that David's mind works as normal, but he perceives a different reality to other people because, as we've seen, him having lived with a monster in his head for his whole life, then going to a mental hospital, and then being told he had powers, all made him have a twisted view of reality. David's mind is fixed because now he can think clearly for himself, without Farouk in his head, or the drugs he took before or during his stay at Clockworks. But his reality is alternate because his perception of reality has been twisted due to his life experiences that I pointed out. Neither of those relate to David's body, they relate to his mind, thus contradicting what Wisecrack Man is trying to say.
But while this is an interesting hook into the show, it's hard to say if the show is really using panpsychism or metaphors to make any deeper arguments about the nature of reality or experience.
Considering I've disproved any attempt they had at trying to say the show does talk about panpsychism, it's hard to say that because they're wrong. Also, if they don't know if the show is making a larger point about panpsychism, then what was the point of bringing it up? They said that this was one of their two best guesses as to what season 3 means, but then they arrived at the conclusion that they can't know for certain that the show is using it as a philosophy, thus making the entire video so far worthless. But, you know, don't worry, it will get worse.
When it comes to panpsychism, the show never seems to really draw out any of the implications of having reality and your mind being both equally real, especially in regards to David.
He literally played a clip 10 seconds before this one, where Farouk says David's reality and his mind aren't on the same plane. We also have shit like this in season 2.
A wise man once said, "Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away."
Showing that someone's perception of reality, their mind, is not as real as reality itself, since reality is immutable.
And when it comes to metaphor, it sometimes feels like the show is confusing for the sake of being confusing. Sure, in an oversaturated superhero market, it might be fun to see musical numbers stand in for dialogue.
There's only one way this can end. A rap battle.
So him saying the show is confusing for the sake of being confusing is weird to me, because he just said the show plays with the idea of what is real or not because of David's perception of reality. Therefore, the confusion presented by the show's presentation is warranted so we can understand how David feels, especially in season 1, when he's the one whose eyes we see the show through. It's also interesting, he says musical numbers sometimes stand in for dialogue, but almost all the musical numbers stand in for fights and not dialogue. Even the example he used, it wasn't a dialogue Oliver was going to have with the wolf. It was a fight so that Oliver could save Cynthia from the wolf. We also have scenes like the Behind Blue Eyes one in chapter 19, or the dance battle in chapter 9. It's never a stand-in for dialogue, except for one scene in season 3 where David sings "What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding" to Switch. So he's wrong here, and it doesn't even support his point, even if he was right, but let's continue.
But sometimes we'd like to understand the literal narrative.
I understood it. Though Legion is a very layered, complex, and ambiguous show, which means watching it once makes it hard to grasp what everything means. Saying that it's impossible to understand the literal meaning of what's happening is just blatantly ignoring the hard work the show puts into making its story, while crazy and unconventionally structured, consistently written within the rules and the characters that have been established.
After all, according to playwright and screenwriter David Mamet, the core of drama is about finding previously unsuspected meaning in chaos. The truth that had been previously obscured by lies.
I don't know what the fuck you're saying, but I know it's bullshit.
Now, after looking deep into that quote and the book it comes from to figure out what the fuck it means, I've come to the realization that the quote is referring to characters, more specifically character journeys. The full context of the quote is, drama is about lies. Drama is about repression, as that which is repressed is liberated. At the conclusion of the play, the power of repression is vanquished, and the hero, the audience's surrogate, is made more whole. Drama is about finding previously unsuspected meaning in chaos, about discovering the truth that had previously been obscured by lies, and about our persistence in accepting lies. In great drama, we recognize that freedom may lie beyond, and is achieved through the painful questioning of what was before supposed unquestionable. In the great drama, we follow a supposedly understood first principle to its astounding and unexpected conclusion. We are pleased to find ourselves able to revise our understanding. There may be politically correct spectacle, there can be no politically correct drama. The very term should occasion revulsion in anyone who values democracy and the most democratic of arts, the theater. Since David Mamet refers to the chaos within the hero's journey and how the hero getting through the chaos and emerging on the other side makes the truth clearer and the hero more whole, the quote does not fit with the context of the video, since the video is referring to the show not showing the literal meaning behind what each event means, which I guess is the chaos, but the quote they're showing has nothing to do with that, and Legion does show the literal meaning of its event, so I don't really see their point. It's also funny to point out how their source, David Mamet, is not regarded as one of the best speakers on the subject of drama and writing.
But maybe we should be okay with Legion's uneven use of metaphor. For a show that's so out there in terms of art direction, maybe all the metaphors are just a way to tell an interesting story. Philosophy be damned.
Even if the show didn't have anything to say about philosophy, which would be blatantly false, he just admitted that the metaphors are used to tell the story, so what's the problem with that? And if they are used to that end, then the use of metaphors is not uneven like they claim, it's actually really consistent. It just doesn't follow what Wisecrack wants it to follow, the pretentious pseudo-intellectual crap they want the show to be instead of what it is, which is an exploration of mental illness within the context of a superhero show.
Going back to our philosophers, Moran and Davidson, metaphors don't have to necessarily make sense. The important thing is the effect, the framing. And effect seems to be Legion's MO. It's all about that style.
What they're saying about that use of metaphor is hard to grasp. I tried looking for what exactly they meant with that within Richard Moran's study, but I couldn't find it. So I'll use my own interpretation to try to make sense of this point. He says that metaphors don't need to make sense, because what matters is the effect they have. But a metaphor does need to make sense, because it's comparing one thing to the other to create an association within the two. If the metaphor makes no sense, then its effect is null, since the effect is always to contextualize something through a comparison with something else. Therefore, this point doesn't really make sense unless further explained, which Wisecrack doesn't do.
So maybe we should forgive the show for pelting us with various dance numbers, loquacious asides.
It's about the order of things, the order you learn. When you were young, we let you be wild, because wildness is important. But as you got older, we gave you structure, so you'd feel safe.
And the very weird astral plane.
I'm the supine lupine, my libido kills sunshine, moody and spicy like a fine-ass toilet wine.
So this is a lot to break down. No, we should not excuse a show if it has poor execution or poor writing, if it has a good presentation. Just because a show is stylistically rich, that doesn't mean it's good. Suicide Squad is a film that has its own style, its own form of presentation, and it's pretty much the focus of the film, but that doesn't mean it isn't a mess of a film. Or, Loki, that is visually amazing, has a fantastic soundtrack, great actors, and terrible writing. Now, liking the presentation regardless of writing quality is fair enough if that's your standard, but to say definitely that we should look past story and thematic cohesion to focus on presentation is an incredibly defeatist attitude to have in regard to filmmaking. Not only that, but it's untrue to say that Legion is all about style and not substance, which I think I've proven thoroughly here and on my other Legion videos. Also, the fact he says we should forgive the show for having various dance numbers and loquacious asides because it's all about style is preposterous, considering the dance numbers actually all have purposes within the story. The easiest one to use as an example is the season 2 dance battle between Farouk, using Lenny and Oliver's faces, and David. What Noah Hawley says is that a battle between psychic mutants wouldn't be a battle of strength, and would more be a battle of minds, which gives him the creative freedom to show how a fight between David and Farouk would be, since they're both psychic mutants. Farouk even mentions it to Charles Xavier in season 3, that their power is an incredible outlet for creativity and freedom, yet they choose to use it for violence, like David did in chapter 10 as well, showing how their minds aren't yet thinking of the endless possibilities of how they could use their powers. But we have a few scenes that do show what that could be it David and Farouk fighting in chapter 19, or them fighting in chapter 27 when David sings Mother by Pink Floyd. The musical numbers are meant to show how a battle of minds would be, as opposed to a battle of strength and physicality. The other point they bring up is that the show has loquacious asides that should be forgiven due to the presentation and style in Legion, which they then use the very weird clip to use as an example. First off, an aside in literature is when a character breaks a fourth wall when other characters can't hear what they're saying, which is not something that happens often in Legion, since other characters can pretty much always hear what the characters are saying, unless you count John Hamm's narrations as asides, which would be a good example of an aside, so I'll count just anytime a character may be talking to the audience to fit that definition. So the example they use is not an aside, it's a character teaching a lesson to another character, a lesson that is important in character development and growth for Sid. So it's not a monologue where Oliver is speaking to the audience, it's Oliver speaking to Sid. There are a few examples of what you may call asides in Legion, such as the opening scene in chapter 4, or David's monologue at the beginning of chapter 27, which I'd only call Oliver's one loquacious, but that's not really the point. The point is that they used an example that doesn't fit with what they're saying when there are better examples from the show they could have pulled, which isn't the first time they've done this in this video, but I digress. Now, scenes like the opening scene of chapter 4 or the opening scene of chapter 27 are achieving a lot, the former by foreshadowing and setting up the conflict with David, Farouk, and his own mind, while also introducing Oliver as a character and giving us our first look at the astral plane, and the latter by developing David's character to get him to the end of his journey later in the episode. It's not just talking for the sake of talking, and to say John Hamm's narrations are also just for stylistic purposes would be diminishing their impact on the way the audience interprets the story and also contradict what they said earlier about them having meaning in season 2. Therefore, there is no way to look at what they're saying and come to the conclusion that Legion is pure style and no substance, unless you didn't pay attention to the show. He also mentions a very weird astral plane is another point of something we should forgive for being all about style, which I've gone through the astral plane enough, but I'd just like to add that they think the rap battle is a creation of the astral plane itself, instead of it being Oliver creating it, at least by the way Wisecrack worded it, which is definitely not true if you watch the show, as I've mentioned earlier.
Maybe all Legion is trying to do is keep it interesting. So deep? Maybe not.
So they brought up 2 ideas that had nothing to do with the show, despite saying that they were the best interpretations they could come up with as to what season 3 meant, then said the show doesn't really follow them, thus defeating the purpose of this entire portion of their video, then claimed the show is not deep because it doesn't follow this specific thread of philosophy they bring up, then took a huge leap to the conclusion that Legion is more about style than substance. This is not a good look for Wisecrack. So far, we're only halfway through the video and nothing of value has been said about the show. Funnily enough, they claim Legion is all about style and it doesn't say anything, and that's exactly what this video is. Pure pseudo-intellectual conjecture.
Idea 2, time and change. Of course, the big shakeup in season 3, other than Pataname's mustache, is the addition of the time traveler, Switch. Now, it might seem unfair to put Legion's depiction of time travel under the microscope.
Now, at least from the title of this portion, I agree that this idea is an overarching idea Legion explores, about time and change.
It's about change.
Chapter 27 starts with David saying,
Because if we don't believe in change, then we don't believe in time.
So I agree with their premise that this is what the 3rd season may have been about. Their arguments are still not presented, so we'll see if there's an issue with that. What I do want to say about this clip is that this is a really weird precedent to set. They'll explain it by being comic book logic, but we should always put stories under a microscope and analyze them. What they don't realize is how analyzing aspects of fantasy or sci-fi in media isn't going to be dictated by the real world, unless the piece of media analyzed tries to follow real world rules, which can happen in fantasy or sci-fi, but to a lesser extent, since those genres usually establish internal rules for their in-universe plot elements, though they of course follow external consistency in some aspects, but I digress. These aspects are analyzed by how they're set up and established in the piece of media itself, and how they stay consistent with them throughout it, which, luckily, is what Legion does. Just because an aspect of a piece of content is goofy, comic booky, or fantastical, that doesn't mean it shouldn't follow its own established rules, since that's how stakes are established, through cause and effect. But they also should be analyzed as their own thing, instead of pulling real-world facts when the rules have been established to not follow real-world rules, like Legion, as Wisecrack will demonstrate later.
When it comes to comic book characters, we kind of just have to grant the initial premise. Radioactive spiders giving you superpowers instead of cancer? Sure, why not?
And I have a huge issue with this statement. Just because something is a comic book adaptation, that doesn't mean the logic of the story should be thrown aside for comic book logic. As I mentioned previously, all we have to do to judge how logically sound the story is assess whether or not it follows its own established rules consistently. For example, Wisecrackman uses the example of Spider-Man 1, where the radioactive spider bites Peter and gives him powers, and that it's acceptable because it's a comic book, despite the bite probably having to give Peter cancer. Firstly, radiation doesn't work that way they're implying, and the spiders aren't even radioactive in Spider-Man 1. Secondly, that scene has its plethora of issues, and the way it's explained why Peter is granted powers in it is also quite problematic. Peter goes on a high school trip to this university where they're researching spiders and trying to modify the spider's DNA to create new species, trying to apply that theory to humans at some point, as in trying to transfer DNA codes among other humans to wipe out diseases, make people genetically stronger and whatnot. The tour guide says,
"This is the recombination lab, where we use synthesized transfer RNA to encode an entirely new genome, combining genetic information from all 3 spiders into these 10 genetically designed super spiders, the first mankind has ever produced. Just imagine if one day we can isolate the strengths, powers, and immunities in human beings and transfer that DNA code among ourselves, all known disease could be wiped out. Of course, we're nowhere near ready to start experimenting with humans, nor do we know that we ever should. So for the moment, we're concentrating on these 10 spiders. Any questions?"
To explain why this makes no sense, I'll let my friend Shandy do the talking.
However, it just means that during the 5-year time period it took to do this, they have accidentally created a super soldier serum greater than that of Osborne Industries. Now, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. Human beings make important discoveries all the time. The discovery of penicillin, for example, was done on accident. But how exactly does redesigning spiders and enhancing them with the DNA of spiders that already exist translate to giving human beings, and possibly other creatures, spider powers when bitten? But whatever, comic book movie's got a comic book movie. I personally feel like this specific plot point was done better in the TASM films, where the reason the spiders were created was to try and use their healing abilities to cure Norman Osborn. But since Richard Parker used his DNA as the basis for the spiders, after he died, Oscorp couldn't continue the research on them without him, instead opting to use lizards with Kirk Connors. But instead of abandoning the spiders altogether, they used them to manufacture super cables with their webbing, which then allows Peter to become Spider-Man after being bitten. The scenario is nowhere near as contrived as what we get in this movie and makes sense in the universe, since we understand why Peter would be the only one affected by these spiders. Now, I would personally prefer it if we don't know where the spider came from, or what its intended purpose is, but since we do get an explanation, it just reaffirms my position of TASM doing it better. I mean, imagine if the spider that bit Peter in the Raimi movie went ahead and bit another person, and potentially a few more, giving them all spider powers. Wouldn't that be interesting?
He made a great video on Spider-Man 1, which I really recommend watching. Just click the link in the description. Basically, the spiders have no reason to be able to transfer their abilities to Peter. They just do because the film needs it to happen, which you can see why it'd be a substantial problem when it's the premise of the entire franchise. Getting back to my main point, you don't have to grant the initial premise just because the piece of media is based on a comic book, because sometimes you have premises like these that are broken from their inception, breaking rules to start the story. In this case, it'd be external consistency rather than their own established rules, since we know spiders in the real world can't just transfer their abilities to humans, but they can in this universe, which you can see why it would create problems in that universe, considering nobody has ever gotten abilities from spiders before or after Peter. It's a big world building issue.
And early on, Legion playfully reminds us that its depiction of time travel isn't going to trade too heavily on science.
What do you know about time travel?
I have a PhD in quantum mechanics and a master's in nuclear physics.
Have you ever seen the hall?
The hall?
Time. There's a hallway. It moves in two directions, forwards and back. And by drawing a doorway in the air, like this, I can access the time stream.
But there has to be some internal logic going on, right? Well, in Legion's case, not really.
Before we move on to what we can all imagine are terrible arguments to support that claim, first I'm gonna preface it by saying, firstly, he's right that Legion does explain the time travel and it doesn't trade too heavily on science, which, to be honest, is expected when time travel cannot happen in real life. But it's not like time travel when the show happens due to scientific discoveries or something, like in Back to the Future, Avengers Endgame, or Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. It's a character with powers to access a hallway in which you can travel through time and space, so that's correct. And the clip Wisecrack uses to prove their point is a good clip, even if they do use more of it than they had to, but that's fine. Secondly, I can safely call bullshit on the fact that Legion does not need consistent rules for time travel. Firstly, because every story needs rules for how its internal logic works. Otherwise, the stakes are ruined. Consistency is key in creating content that is emotionally resonant. Of course, I don't expect everyone to follow my standards, of internal consistency being how you judge the quality of media, but that doesn't mean something should have plot holes. Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that a story will never be hurt for making sense. Nobody has ever said, I dislike that film because it made too much sense. Therefore, there's no possible way to explain what they mean by saying that Legion doesn't need to follow internal logic when it comes to time travel, especially when it does follow that.
In fact, the final season continually fails to address one of the biggest logical problems in time travel: the grandfather paradox.
So this is retarded. Funnily enough, I recently had a discussion about this topic with my friend Thought Theater, in which he argued Legion's time travel would create a paradox due to how time travel works, which is not the case. One thing people don't realize is that what matters is the established rules of the media at hand, not rules that the media never established and aren't even rules in the real world. This may take a while to explain, so bear with me. So what is the grandfather paradox?
We're their ancestors. If they destroy us, won't that destroy them?
Let's bring us to the grandfather paradox.
The what?
If you went back in time and killed your own grandfather, how could you have been born to commit the act?
What's the answer?
There's no answer. It's a paradox.
Now, if time travel were possible in the real world, how are we to know that's how it'd work? As a lot of media does it. Sometimes they create a new timeline. Sometimes it takes a while for the new timeline to override the old one, so we can't know if the grandfather paradox would apply to the real world. Now, in media, we can actually know if they apply or not. With Doctor Who, for example, the rules are inconsistent for how time travel works, to be honest, but in some instances we know it does apply. There are moments where they mention it, and even an episode where that's how they get out of conflict with the Weeping Angels. The show establishes its rules, and we can understand that the grandfather paradox is indeed a thing in that show that can actually happen. So the Doctor constantly says that traveling back to their own timelines is extremely risky. Those are defined rules to set the stakes of time travel and why certain actions can't happen. And then we have Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I was gonna use Avengers Endgame, but that film breaks its own rules by the end, so I think it's better to steer clear. In Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 5, the team, after being sent back to the present, after they experience what happened to Earth in the future, they actively try to change the event so that the future they saw never comes to be. By the end of the season, they actually do it, and the team is still alive, and Deke, a character that was from the future and traveled back with them, is also alive, therefore confirming that in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., when someone travels back in time and changes something, they create an alternate timeline of events, which is something they explore further in Season 7. That show explicitly has rules that say the grandfather paradox does not apply. And so we come to Legion. The only explicit rule that Legion establishes about time travel is that people who travel back in time will disappear after they change how events transpire.
You're doing this for a woman you love, who lives in a future you're going to destroy if you help me.
What do you mean?
The timeline. She lives in a future you're trying to change, and when you do, she will cease to exist.
Unless you're a time traveler like Switch, since she's a fourth-dimensional being. Therefore, she can survive changed events in the timeline. Now, just because a person who changes the events is erased, that doesn't mean their past is erased, since that's never established. The show never establishes that what happens is like if you go into the crack in Doctor Who Season 5, where the character just is erased from existence in a way where he's not remembered by anyone, therefore also erasing their past. It's also not established that the character being erased means his past never happened, therefore creating the grandfather paradox, and that stays consistent throughout seasons 2 and 3. By that logic, Legion doesn't follow the theory of the grandfather paradox. It's not established within its rules. Thus, it doesn't have to deal with it as a concept, since it's not real in the show's canon. So that's a dumb notion to have. I'm sorry, Thought.
That is, how can time travel be possible if you went back in time, killed your grandfather, and made sure you were never born to go back and kill said grandfather? Now, there are a lot of ways to tackle this problem. You could go the Marvel route and just say no matter what you do while swanning around in the past, the future doesn't change.
Time doesn't work that way. Changing the past doesn't change the future.
As for Legion, the show's solution can best be summed up as fuck it. Come at me, bro.
总算女儿，你已经发现了世界的真理。它是海洋，不是河川。
So, the clip they just showed has nothing to do with their claim. Not only is their claim dumb, since the rules are consistent, even if not always explicitly stated in the show, but the clip they use has nothing to do with the rules of time travel. It has more to do with Switch's journey as a character, to learn that she shouldn't mess with time because time is not as simple as a river that flows naturally, and that you can guide. It's a notion that is too much for one person to handle. That scene does not mention any rules or say fuck it in regards of what time travel is. Their claim that the show does say fuck it to establishing rules is bullshit. So they didn't have any way of backing their claim with a clip from the show. But the one they did use is one of the worst clips they could have gotten to try to do so.
Yeah, so David does successfully change his past by keeping his parents together and saving his baby self from Amal Farouk. In doing so, he literally erases his current self.
So now what? We just sort of
fade away into the ether.
How does this square with the fact that if David hadn't shared his brain with Farouk for 33 years, he wouldn't have gone back in time in the first place? It doesn't.
This would be going off of the assumption that the show does follow the theory of the grandfather paradox, which it doesn't, so it's a self-defeating argument.
But maybe Legion isn't trying to make a logical argument about time travel. Maybe this aspect of the story, as trippy and sometimes nonsensical as it is in service of a larger message. We're brought back to the idea of metaphor. The beginning of Legion's final episode starts with this text flashing across the screen. This is the end, the beginning, the end. What it all means is not for us to know. It is for history to decide. All we can do is play the parts as written. All we can know is ourselves. On the surface of it, it seems strange for Legion to frame the final episode with a quote.
So they start this part with that self-defeating argument again, so I won't bother responding to it. Then they say the rules not making sense is the point Legion is making, and tie that with a quote that starts chapter 27, the finale of the show. How he's gonna relate the two, we'll see, but I'll preface that by saying that there is no possible correlation between the two, because the idea comes from a faulty premise since the time travel does make sense in the show as I've explained. I just paused at this point of their clip to talk about how hilarious it is that they say it's strange for Legion to frame the final episode with a quote, despite the show using quotes all the time to contextualize certain events or accentuate certain character moments.
fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting.
Even Oliver in chapter 4, when he's telling a story, says,
Wait. A quote. A great philosopher once wrote, "In times of peace, the warlike man attacks himself."
There is nothing new about Legion framing an episode with a quote, so I just thought it was funny that Wisecrack claims it's strange for the last episode to do so.
After all, if David and company are just playing their parts as written, how are they supposed to change the past? And what does self-knowledge have to do with, well, anything?
And this clearly shows a complete misunderstanding of the opening quote in the finale. The quote reads,
"This is the end, the beginning, the end. What it means is not for us to know, it is for history to decide. All we can do is play the parts as written. All we can know is ourselves."
And now it's my time to put my Legion expertise to use. So the quote can seem weird at first before the episode plays out. Hell, it may seem weird after it does, but I've seen Legion way too much to not pick up on what it's laying down. When the show says that
"This is the end, the beginning, the end,"
it's saying that after they change the past, this is the end of their journey. The characters we've been following, well, it's the end of the road for them. However, it's also a beginning. A new beginning for baby David, for Charles and Gabrielle, for the versions in this new timeline of the characters that are gonna disappear from the old one. Like David says,
The past changes and the future disappears. So Clark, Lanny, we all get a do-over.
That's what the first part implies. Then the show says,
"What it means is not for us to know, it is for history to decide."
the show means that, whether it's a beginning or an end, it's not for us to know. Us, as in the characters in the show, it's for history to decide. History will decide whether that was the start of something new or the end of a story, but the characters can't know, since the future is impossible for them to predict. And I do have reason to believe that the show means the characters when it says us, which I'll get into. Then the quote says,
"All we can do is play the parts as written. All we can know is ourselves."
This part is a reason why us means the characters, because
"All we can do is play the parts as written"
clearly means the characters playing their parts of changing the world. Sid and the Loudermilks defending baby David and Gabrielle from the time demons, and David trying to kill younger Farouk, while present-day Farouk talks to Charles to try to get a chance to talk to past Farouk to make him see the error of his ways. Those are the parts they have to play, and they're written due to Switch's father, the fifth dimensional being that sees all, and orchestrated this to make his daughter go through her journey and to get the characters of the show to finish their journeys. So much so that Switch even lets them have their final goodbye before they fade away. She gives them more time to say goodbye, playing their parts as written. And therefore, since the characters can't know if this is the beginning or the end, if all they can do is play their parts as written, all they can know is who they are and why they decided to do what they're doing. AKA, all they can know is themselves. With that, I've answered their questions regarding the quote and provided context for why it's there in the first place and how it applies to the show, so let's move on.
But what if this text is a metaphor, asking us to reframe everything we've seen in 3 seasons according to these words? In this case, the show hints that everything David has done, past and present, from being born to cartoon fighting Amal Farouk, has been necessary. That David needed to quite literally experience time in order for him to change and thereby save the world.
That's pretty much what the show means. The show does mean that the characters are playing their parts as written, whether it be only during season 3, since that's the season with the fifth dimensional being that control the events of the season, or the entire show. I think it could go both ways, but it works better applying to the entire show, I'd say. These characters had to experience all they did so they could get to the point where they can go back in time and turn things right. Their journey served as the outcome from that. David being raised by his loving parents, Farouk not looking for revenge or power, but now only trying to live his life and experience it without looking for ways to prove his superiority. So yeah, Wisecrack is right on this point, honestly. That means that their questions about what the quote meant were stupid, since they pretty much answered them themselves. However, there is one thing I'd like to point out. Wisecrack says,
"But what if this text is a metaphor?"
Which, yeah, of course it is. It's comparing the end of the show, and maybe the entire show, to the meaning of that quote. It's obviously a metaphor, because they say it as if it's a completely new and genius discovery on their part, which is clearly not.
And while it might seem like we're reaching here, this theory does fit with the rest of the show. In fact, the idea that characters needed to experience time to change is integral to all our major players' arc. Sid, for example, must live a second childhood in the astral plane. Under the watch of Oliver and Melanie, she goes from being the understandably rage-filled girl shooting her rapist to a kick-ass, self-actualized woman who knows how to save the world.
I know, honey. But here's the thing. The real world needs you. All those bad things, they don't have to be bad. They can be fixed.
I don't disagree with anything they've said here. I just want to say that the clip they used is contradictory to their point if you know the context of how that scene is recontextualized by the end of the episode, and did not need to be included.
Likewise, the 30+ years Amal Farouk spent in David's head has changed him.
I saw what he saw. I felt what he felt. I thought what he thought. And over time, what was once a prison became a person.
I also agree with this, and the clip they used is pretty good to exemplify their point. Though the one when present Farouk is talking to past Farouk would work better, though they used that clip right after, which is used well within the context of the video, so don't have an issue with it honestly.
When present Farouk finally sizes up his past self, he can barely contain the contempt for the person he once was.
Bonzen, you have become soft in your old age. Was I really this bitter? Filled with hate. How petty you seem.
But what about David? Does he really change?
I'm okay with the first part of this clip, but that question at the end is stupid. Of course David changes. David starts his life as a strange kid who is slightly manipulated by the monster in his head to do things that are morally bad or questionable at best, which leads him to be admitted into a psychiatric hospital, where we see him wanting to live a normal life, which he has wanted for a long time, even before Clockworks.
Why can't you have what everyone else has, a nice home, a family?
Because I'm sick.
They explore that in season 1, and then he finds out he has powers and he's not schizophrenic, which leads him to believing he could potentially live a normal life.
Run away with me.
He could have Sid as his partner and just be happy after all is said and done with Farouk. And then in season 2, he now believes he's not sick at all. He thinks he's a good person. He thinks the shit he did in his past isn't his fault. He sees himself as a victim in season 2. And then by the end of season 2, he sees himself as a god basically.
I don't believe in God.
I think you do.
He thinks he's unequivocally a good person, despite evidence to the contrary. It's the delusion he created for himself. He changed from the person in season 1 who thought he was terrible, into a person that thinks he's a good guy, that he's a victim, that he hasn't done anything wrong, or at least that it wasn't his fault when he did. And that's where he is in season 3. He goes back in time to stop Farouk from entering his body because he thinks everything that went wrong in his life is Farouk's fault, and he's not to blame for any of it. So yes, he does change. I guess the best way to exemplify how he's changed is to show these two clips side by side. One from chapter 8, the season 1 finale, and the other from chapter 23 in season 3.
Don't you get it? I am so sick of myself. This only works if it's not about me.
I can change the past.
Then change this. Free the prisoners. Raise the dead.
No, this is not about the world. This is about me.
According to our girl Sid, there's no saving the present David. He's broken goods.
David, adult David, we can't save him. He's too far gone. But a baby? This baby? Him we can save.
So how does time help David change? Quite literally by unwriting his existence.
So the question of, does David change, that they asked is ignored, so it was worthless to bring up. Then they move on to saying that time helps David change by unwriting his existence, which can somewhat be them answering their question, but it's phrased poorly and doesn't really work with what they're going for, as in the characters needing to experience time to go through change and arrive at that point in the story, because what they're saying here isn't actually true, since David isn't unwritten by time, and that makes him change. It's David himself doing that. David goes back in time to change the past and therefore erase himself and create the new timeline, thus changing baby David's future, aka changing himself in a way.
Listen to this narration David gives in the beginning of the final episode. Again, it serves to reframe everything we've seen up to this point in the show.
Lessons in Time Travel. Chapter 0. Who we were does not dictate who we will be. But often, it's a pretty good indication. Time travel does not give one the opportunity to change oneself, but rather to eradicate oneself. And allow something else to form in the wake of what once was.
In other words, change for David could only come through destruction, and he can only achieve that destruction by messing with time.
So they were doing well until they decided to explain what David said in other words. What David said does not mean that he can only change through destruction, so much so that his change by the end of the episode comes from peace and not destruction. It's his father and present Farouk talking it out, rather than him killing past Farouk as he intended. David's speech is saying that time travel gives you the opportunity to change events and create a new you, not by changing who you are, but eradicating who you were and replacing you with another version of you. That's what time travel does. That's not David having to cause change through destruction and using times as a means to that end. It's David using time travel to change the past and explaining its consequences, not in any way requiring destruction for that change.
It's madness, and it's a complete twist on how other characters experience time in order to change, but madness is David's MO.
So they ignored the change that David went through in the show in order to support an argument that goes against their initial point about time and change, so that's interesting, especially when you consider Future Sid in Season 2 did the exact same thing as David did. She went back in time to change the past, thus eradicating an old version of herself and causing change through destruction, as Wisecrack puts it. Therefore, David is not the only character who experiences change through time that way, especially when it's not him experiencing it. As I've said, it's him causing it. His change happened like it did to any other character, through their experiences in their lives, through them experiencing time, as Wisecrack puts it.
Finally, in the closing minutes of the show, Legion seems to suggest that there's almost a cosmic plan to this change.
It did that in the opening of the episode as well, something I explained and they pointed out, though they could have meant the characters had to experience time, not in the way of it being meant to be like that cosmically, but that they had to experience those journeys to arrive at that point naturally. But I just find it weird how he says it's only happening now when it clearly isn't, as I've explained.
Whether it's Sydney's second childhood or David's suicide gamble. When Switch dies in the final episode, it's revealed that she's not human at all, but quite literally the embodiment of time itself.
How do you know I'm time?
Small correction, she doesn't die. Her and her father go to experience existence untethered from their human bodies, or their screens as they call it. And her screen is not Switch dying, it's her shedding her screen and achieving a higher form of being, which is her natural form. Her father even says that he can use his earthly carapace to diminish himself to a simpler form, which means they're a higher form of being, and Switch is like a butterfly who got out of her cocoon, which is her human form. So it's not death, despite what Wisecrack said.
When Switch returns back to Earth, she lets everyone know that there was meaning to the change they underwent. That Switch, as an embodiment of time in the universe itself, has validated them.
Sydney Barrett, Gabrielle Xavier, and the infant David. The universe acknowledges you. That you exist, and that your existence is important. I can see that you've suffered. That people you love have suffered. And you want to know that it meant something. It did. It does. Nothing of value is ever lost.
And even though the present them will perish, it was also better versions of themselves shall flourish in their place. So what do we make of Legion's take on time and change? Again, I think it's best to invoke Davidson's work on metaphor here. As Davidson rightly points out, how many facts are conveyed by a photograph? None in infinity? Or one great unstateable fact? Bad question. A picture is not worth 1,000 words, or any other number. Words are the wrong currency to exchange for a picture. In the same way, holding Legion's take on time and change to a philosophical standard might not be the right approach.
So I agree with what they say in regards to Switch and Sid and whatever. What I have a problem with is them using that quote from Davidson, since it doesn't really mean anything on its own or in this context. What the issue is that Wisecrack seems to be omitting context that would give the quote meaning. So I decided to look into the book they took the quote from to provide the full context. It should make us suspect the theory that it is so hard to decide, even in the case of the simplest metaphors, exactly what the content is supposed to be. The reason it is often so hard to decide is, I think, that we imagine there is a content to be captured when all the while we are in fact focusing on what the metaphor makes us notice. If what the metaphor makes us notice were finite in scope and proportional in nature, this would not in itself make trouble. We would simply project the content the metaphor brought to mind onto the metaphor. But in fact, there is no limit to what a metaphor calls to our attention, and much of what we are caused to notice is not proportional in character. When we try to say what a metaphor means, we soon realize there is no end to what we want to mention. If someone draws his finger along a coastline on a map, or mentions the beauty and deftness of a line in a Picasso etching, how many things are drawn to your attention? You might list a great many, but you cannot finish since the idea of finishing would have no clear application. How many facts or propositions are conveyed by a photograph? None, an infinity, or one great unstateable fact? Bad question. A picture is not worth 1,000 words. Or any other number. Words are the wrong currency to exchange for a picture. It's not only that we can't provide an exhaustive catalog of what has been attended to when we are led to see something in a new light. The difficulty is more fundamental. What we notice or see is not, in general, propositional in character. Of course it may be, and when it is, it usually may be stated in fairly plain words. But if I show you Wittgenstein's duck rabbit, and I say, it's a duck, then with look, you see it as a duck. If you say, it's a rabbit, you see it as a rabbit. But no proposition expresses what I have led you to see. Perhaps you have come to realize that the drawing can be seen as a duck or a rabbit. But one could come to know this without ever seeing the drawing as a duck or as a rabbit, seeing as is not seeing that. Metaphor makes us see one thing as another by making some literal statement that inspires or prompts the insight. Since in most cases, what the metaphor prompts or inspires is not entirely, or even at all, recognition of some truth or fact. The attempt to give literal expression to the content of the metaphor is simply misguided. Now, with context, what Davidson means is that, like photographs, there are too many meanings that can be applied to metaphors, infinite meanings and interpretations according to him, and Wisecrack tries to apply this to Legion, by saying the entire show forms a picture that is hard to grasp which specific meaning it has, since it has infinite meanings. All the interpretations of what the show means cannot be assessed, and now I'm gonna refute that and poke a hole in this philosophy that Wisecrack is trying to follow. So there aren't infinite interpretations of an image, photograph, or metaphor. Firstly because if you think about it, a photo, a painting, or whatever piece of art it may be, has immutable facts about it. A film will always have the same contents, for example. There can be different cuts of the same film, but each cut will be a different film, and they'll always be the same no matter what. With that, we can see literally everything that is in that film and what's not in it. Therefore, you cannot say that there are infinite interpretations if there are things that cannot be interpreted, because that would make the interpretations finite. Example being, you cannot say that Iron Man showed up in Aquaman, and therefore any interpretations that come from that are wrong. Following that logic, any interpretation of a piece of art that contradicts what's in it is wrong, meaning that there is a finite number of interpretations due to the finite number of elements in any piece of art. And secondly, the idea that metaphors can have infinite meanings is even more absurd when metaphors are simply comparisons between two or more elements to create a correlation between the elements, using the context given to generate some new meaning. As an example, if you say to someone you're dating, you're an angel, that could mean they're a very good person, they're beautiful, they're the best thing they could be. Those are all used to create a hyperbolic meaning of what the message you want to say is, since you could just as easily say, you're beautiful, and leave it at that. However, there cannot be infinite meanings to metaphors, as I stated earlier in the video, since words have definitions, a finite number of them, and each metaphor will compare something that has a finite number of characteristics and definitions with another, thus limiting the metaphor to those meanings, and not being able to have infinite interpretations. And so, that doesn't make sense. However, if Wisecrack is to follow that philosophy, they'll run into a huge issue. If Legion, like metaphors or photographs, according to Donald Davidson and Wisecrack, has infinite meanings and interpretations, that means that anything else they've ever analyzed has those infinite meanings, since the same idea would apply to any form of art and media. Therefore, they cannot possibly know if what they're analyzing is deep or dumb, since they'd never be able to say exactly what they're analyzing means, since it could mean literally anything, which not only renders this video pointless, but also any video of the Deep or Dumb series in their channel, and every video called The Philosophy of. This argument from Wisecrack renders most of their channel pointless according to that standard. What a terrible argument. And that brings us to the end of the video.
At the end of the day, Noah Hawley decided to not make a philosophical argument with the show, but rather an artistic one. And like in time travel, in this choice there is a sort of grace or madness. Whatever deeper meaning there is here, if any at all, the show's not giving us any hints. Overall, we give Legion a 5 out of 10 for smarts. But hey, maybe we're just not getting it.
So them giving the show a 5 out of 10 is really dumb when it's following, according to Wisecrack, the philosophy of not meaning anything in particular and having multiple meanings, therefore having an overarching philosophy and following the criteria they deem to be judging the show by perfectly. That's all according to them though, so their arguments are not only contradictory to their conclusion and their premise, but also they make no sense with the context of the show, as I've proven time and time again. It's also funny that Wisecrackman says that Legion decides not to make a philosophical statement with the show, but rather an artistic one, which contradicts what he said about infinite possibilities of what metaphors and art can mean, since Legion would be talking about multiple ideas at once instead of one, which means it's not only an artistic argument, but also various philosophical arguments at once. And to build on the dumpster fire that this video is, I'd also like to add that they say, after giving their rating,
but hey, maybe we're just not getting it.
Which renders this video even more pointless by virtue of them admitting they don't know if their conclusion is correct. And with that, the video ends.
How do you contradict yourself this much in this amount of time?
So in conclusion, this video is garbage. As I've shown here, their arguments rely on removing context from the show, erroneous interpretations of events that contradict events of the show, forgetting certain moments in the show, using philosophers that have nothing to do with what Legion tries to say, also using quotes from extremely unreliable sources of arguments, all to prove a point that's self-defeating and makes almost their entire channel retroactively pointless. That's an awful video and I'm surprised nobody realizes that. Of course, not everyone's as analytical and addicted to Legion as I am, but the arguments are so terrible that it impresses me that nobody seems to notice it. I'd say today I proved thoroughly that Wisecrack is not a very reliable source, or at least their argumentation and research when talking about Legion is not good at all. And I hope to have enlightened some people who may have thought that this video was good. So that's it for today. This video was a chore to make with all the research, the redrafts, the editing, and I'm working on 2 other videos in the meantime. I'm editing videos for Ecom, and I've been dealing with real life stuff, but I hope it was all worth it because I do feel like it's a good response to a terrible video about my favorite show. Also, I started a Patreon recently. If you don't follow me on Twitter, you may not know that, and I'd like to thank my patrons for their support. Itanos, Studio Devo, Jabin Bush, and Zach Domit. And if you'd like to become a patron to help out the channel, you can click the link in the description, or if you want to do a one-time donation, there's also a Streamlabs link in the description, and I'll catch y'all next time. Goodbye.